Good afternoon, class. Today we're going to learn a little bit about how to write fiction. Staring at a blank page can often be daunting, especially when we don't know where to begin. In today's lesson, we're going to learn a few steps that will help us become better writers of fiction. The very first thing you will want to do is select a genre and setting. A genre is the kind of fiction you will be writing. There are many different kinds of fiction. There is mystery, adventure, biography, science fiction, poetry, autobiography, fantasy, realistic fiction, and historical fiction. You might ask, are poetry, autobiography, and biographies really fiction? They can be, depending on what they are addressing. For instance, someone might write an autobiography of Mickey Mouse, or a biography of Captain Hook. These are fictional characters, and therefore any work on them, even if it's written in a style of an autobiography or a biography, would be fiction. Poetry, too, doesn't always have to be written about things in the real world. It can be used in fiction. One example of this is the book Inside Out and Back Again, in which an entire story is told through poetry, and the story, while realistic, is fiction. Once you have selected a genre, you're going to want to select a setting. Now that we have selected a genre and setting, we need to create a plot. You might ask, what is a plot? Essentially, the plot is what is going to happen. The plot is the story. This is a simple example of a plot. It begins with an exposition, or it tells us about the story. Many times, stories will begin with something like, once upon a time, in a place far, far away, there lived a young girl. This introduces the setting, and it introduces the characters. Every good plot needs some kind of conflict, which rises in action throughout the story until we come to a climax, or main event. This is the focus of the story, and once the climax has taken place, there is falling action, and finally a resolution. Here is a more complicated diagram. In this diagram, the characters are introduced at the beginning of the story. This is followed by 3 events which lead up to the climax. The climax is defined as an event with the greatest intensity, an event in which a change occurs, and is followed by falling action, where the characters deal with what has happened. The story ends with the resolution, and life goes on. Here is an example using the popular story of Cinderella. In the introduction, Cinderella lives unhappily with her stepsisters and their mother. An invitation to the ball at the palace arrives. We can see the rising action is the stepsisters prepare to go for the ball. A fairy godmother appears and provides Cinderella with clothes and coach and footmen. Cinderella goes to the ball and dances with the prince. Cinderella leaves hurriedly at midnight and loses a slipper. The prince says he will marry the woman whose slipper fits. And the climax is the stepsisters try to force their feet into the slipper, but it only fits Cinderella. In the falling action, Cinderella and the prince marry, and in the resolution, they live happily ever after. So we see the main event here is the ball, where Cinderella meets the prince, and everything else at the beginning of the story leads up to that event, and after the story, it shows how the characters dealt with the repercussions of that event. The final step is to create characters. You want to create a character or characters that your reader can relate to. The best way to do this is to write about what you know. Use your own experiences to create characters that are relatable to your audience. Based on what we have learned today, you should be able to write a short work of fiction comfortably. Let's review the steps one more time. First, decide on a genre. Next, develop a plot. Finally, create character. Now you can begin to write.